When we have spoken of a note, we have meant a particular note in a specific object. So if we were talking about this F, for example, then we identify that as F1 right above C. But we now have the idea of a pitch class. So that when you're talking about F, you mean any F anywhere written in any way. So there's no difference between this F and this one and this one and this one and this one and so on and so on. It's just F, the pitch class of F. Then there's no difference between F and E sharp. It means the same sound, so it's the same pitch class, regardless of how it's written. Everybody okay? Now, we said that the composer puts the 12 chromatic notes in a particular order, and that becomes the basis of the piece. You don't have to copy this down if you understand it. It's okay. So I've actually taken one that is from a piece by Schoenberg, one of his earliest, if not the earliest, in the actual 12-tone technique, after his so-called period of silence while he was figuring all this stuff out. All right, so we said that you can do the pattern frontwards, that you could do the pattern backwards, which is retrograde, that you could do the pattern in inversion upside down, and that you could do the inversion backwards. So you've got 12 different places you could start. In this case, the original one's G flat, but you could transpose it to any other note also and do it in those 4 different ways, frontwards, backwards, upside down, or upside down backwards. All right, so if you're analyzing what form of the row you're talking about at any given time in the piece, then you need to have your answer key so that you can figure out what form of the row it is. Is it a retrograde on G? Is it an inversion on B flat? What is it? So here's how we do that. We write out the original either in letter names or in numbers. Now, a mathematician does matrices with numbers. How would we translate the notes into numbers? Easy. Here's how. Our first pitch, G flat, is the way we would figure it out for this particular piece. So all of these represent then the number of half steps above what we call the 0 note. In this case, we're taking the 0 note as G flat. So that would mean that G natural would be 1 half step above G flat. That becomes 1. G sharp or A flat, that becomes 2. A natural is 3 whole steps above. B flat is 4 whole steps above. 5 whole steps above. 6 whole steps above, and so on and so on and so on. So instead of making it with letter names, you could make it with numbers like that. When you deal with this stuff all the time, then you just have kind of memorized what all the intervals are in terms of how many half steps above a 0 note it is. So you don't have to necessarily figure them all out. You can just pretty much tell by sight. After you've had some practice with it, of course. Just like we do with intervals, you don't have to usually go through some long process to figure out that something is a major third above a different note, right? You can sort of look at it and tell. Well, you get to be the same way with numbers like this. If you've just done enough matrices, then it's old hat after a while. But that's the way you figure out your numbers. Well, I don't do it that often. So I like to do it with the letter names because that means more to me than just sterile numbers. All right, so at least on G flat, we have the original, which is also called the prime version. And we have the retrograde, which is the backwards, in the original transposition on G flat. So we need to figure out what all the others are. So here's our next concept, inversion. In traditional music, that is the common practice period, what we've been dealing with up to now. When you invert intervals, the numbers add up to 9, and that you switch the major and the minor. So the inversion of a major third is a minor sixth. The inversion of a major second is a minor seventh. The perfect, of course, those don't switch. They just add up to 9. Right? Same thing for augmented and diminished. You switch the augmented and diminished, but the numbers still add up to 9. Now, in this system, we have a completely different way of figuring the inversion. The inversion is the exact same interval in the other direction. So it's a mirror. Okay? Now, since we're talking about pitched class, we do not have to figure this first interval as a minor 9. We can also figure it as a minor second. Pitched class. So that's easy to do. All right. So let's take, if this was a minor second down, what's a minor second up? Okay, it's A double flat, but we can call it G, because that's a lot simpler, right? And it's pitch class. So there's the G, all right? This was a major sixth up, so we would need to go a major sixth down from G. B flat? B flat. All right, this is an augmented fourth down. We now need an augmented fourth up. E natural. E. Right. All right, now we have a minor second down. We need a minor second up. F. Augmented fourth up, augmented fourth down. B. B is good. We don't have to call it C flat. We can call it B. Major second up, we need major second down. A sharp? A. Major second. All right, minor second up, minor second down. A flat. Okay. Tritone down, tritone up. D. Minor second down, minor second up. You can call it D sharp if you want to, or you can call it E flat. It's just whether you like to deal with flats or sharps. All right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right. So we would be here. This is major second up, so we want major second down. D flat. You can call it D flat or C sharp. Doesn't matter. And finally, minor second up, minor second down. C. C. Now, you better scan it and make sure that we don't have any duplications, because if we had a duplication, then we just make a mistake. Right? So the way to check it, I guess, is to start with A, so you could go A flat, A, B flat, B, C, D flat, D, E flat, E, F, F sharp or G flat, and G. So we're okay. No duplication. All right, now, what we have is the original across, and we have the inversion, which is to say the mirror, the inversion here. All right, so what we're going to do is, by using all these starting pitches, we're going to transpose the original version to every other note. Right? And it's pretty easy to do as long as you're pretty sharp with intervals. So, if here G flat to G is a minor second up, then we want to go a minor second up of all of them. F to G flat, D to E flat, A flat to A, G to A flat. A flat's good. Could be G sharp, doesn't matter. C sharp to D, D sharp to E, E to F, B flat to B, not C flat, B. A to B flat, B to C, and C to D sharp. C sharp is all right, or D flat, doesn't matter. Pitch class. All right, now this one from G to B flat, we could call it, doesn't matter how it is up there. We could call this a minor third up because that's easier probably to figure the major six. Okay. So we want to go a minor third all the way across because we've got to keep the relationship the same in every single one. It's the original version transposed to all the other pitches. All right, so G to B flat's a minor third, G flat to A, E flat to G flat, A to C, A flat to B, D to F, E to G, F to A flat, B to D flat or C sharp, take your pick. E flat or D sharp, take your pick. E. Okay. Now, here's gets a little harder. B flat to E, you can either call it an augmented fourth up or a diminished fifth down. Take your pick. Augmented fourth up. All right, we got to do that all the way across. So A up to D sharp, G flat up to C, C up to, let's call it G flat, B up to F, F up to D. Nice, they're backwards, right? G up to C sharp, okay. A flat up to D, D up to, okay. Rather call it G sharp? Doesn't matter. D flat up to G. E flat, A, okay. And E up to A sharp? A sharp is all right, unless you want to call it B flat. Doesn't matter. All right, we'll do one more. E to F, minor second up. All right, D sharp to E, C to C sharp, G flat to G, F to, we can call it F sharp. B to C, C sharp to D, D to E flat, G sharp to A, G to A flat, A to B flat, and B. Okay, and this is going to be another tritone. This is a whole step. This is a half step. This is a tritone. This is a half step. This is a whole step. This is a half step. We would do the same thing all the way across from whatever that starting interval is. Right? And so we would complete the entire square. All right. Now, how do you know if you're right? Because if you were, well, let's take what we are doing. We're doing letter names. So the G flat would be consistent. Now, you might have called it F sharp, it doesn't matter, but it's going to be the same thing. If you were doing numbers, that would mean that this number would always be 0 right there. And if you have that, you're pretty secure that you're correct. Because if you make a mistake, it's eventually going to show up, and you won't necessarily know where your date is. So this is the way you make your matrix, your answer key. Now, what's the value of this? Well, because, for example, let's say that you come across a scenario that has 4 notes at the same time. You don't know what the order is. So you'd have to start looking for them. But you would look for them from the outside to the inside. This way. Or this way. Or this way. Or this way. Okay. So this one is the original, or we can call it prime, that way. This one is the inversion. This one is going to be the retrograde in that direction. And this is going to be the retrograde inversion going up like that. So you can analyze out every form of the row in a piece because you've got every single possibility of it there in your answer key. So that's the first thing you have to do. Now, normally the composer lays out the first form of the row in such a way that you can out your analysis procedure considerably because of guesswork. So generally the notes happen one at a time at the beginning so that you can figure out the original form of the row, construct your matrix, and then work from there. Now, a row doesn't necessarily happen consecutively in the same part. It may share parts with other instruments at the same time. So if you're circling a form of the row, you might have a really gerrymandered type of shape because it could go anywhere. Just don't know. They're all likely to be kind of different. So anyway, tone row, pitch class, prime, inversion, retrograde, inversion. As long as you understand these terms, you're kind of okay. And it's not that hard to figure out the matrix, and the better you are at intervals, the quicker it is. But in any case, even if you're not very good, it shouldn't take very long to do that. Generally, if you were in a class and this was on an exam, then they certainly have to just give you the original form of the row and possibly even the matrix too, in order for you to use your time well to analyze what form is operational at any given time. Before we continue with that, let me just back up to Stravinsky a little bit. Stravinsky gave several big lectures at Harvard, and those lectures were compiled into a book which is available, called The Poetics of Music. And here's a little excerpt from one of those lectures. This has to do with his outlook towards musical composition. He says, the creator's function is to sift the elements he receives from imagination, for human activity must impose limits on itself. The more art is controlled, limited, worked over, the more it is free. As for myself, I experience a sort of terror when at the moment of setting to work and finding myself before the infinitude of possibilities that present themselves, I have the feeling that everything is permissible to me. Will I then have to lose myself in this abyss of freedom? To what shall I cling in order to escape the dizziness that seizes me before the virtuality of this infinitude? Fully convinced that combinations which have at their disposal 12 sounds in each octave and all possible rhythmic varieties promise me riches that all the activity of human genius will never exhaust. What delivers me from the anguish into which an unrestricted freedom plunges me is the fact that I'm always able to turn immediately to the concrete things that are here in question. I have no use for a theoretic freedom. Let me have something finite, definite, matter that can lend itself to my operation only insofar as it is commensurate with my possibilities. And such matter presents itself to me together with its limitations. I must in turn impose myself upon it. My freedom thus consists in my moving ahead within the narrow frame that I've assigned myself for each one of my undertakings. I shall go even further. My freedom will be so much the greater and more meaningful the more narrowly I limit my field of action and the more I surround myself with obstacles. Whatever diminishes constraint diminishes strength. The more constraints one imposes, the more one frees oneself of the chains that shackle the spirit. You remember when you were having to write a theme, and the teacher said, well, just write on anything you want. You sit there with your blank paper and you think to myself, all right, I can do anything.
Yeah.
What shall I do? You know, and you don't know what to do. You can't think of anything all of a sudden because it could be anything. So it's much better if he, as the composer, he says, sets forth definite things that he wants to do. And then he can get to work filling those up. So it was much easier for you probably when the teacher gave you for a theme a half dozen or so possible topics and you could just pick the one you wanted, but you've got something definite to shoot for. Several years in the public schools,
since I didn't have a full music program at first when I went to that school. I had to get certified in English and teach English part of the day. And among the several courses that I rotated through, one of them was composition. And so I would try to make the point about brainstorming that if you set your mind to something specific, you can actually write on even the most absurd sounding things. They looked at me like, yeah, whatever. And so I said, okay, here's the topic for today. Women are stronger than men. Let them sit there and wrestle it for a while. And so we started to kick out the ideas. Well, ideas like, well, women live longer. Women resist sickness better. They recover faster. You know, and so on and so on and so on. You just brainstorm for a while. You can really come up with some ideas. But if you're just sitting there with blank paper and no help, then it's like, oh my God, what do I do? I can't think of anything. Right, so Stravinsky's saying the same thing for himself as a composer, that he needs to set up as many limitations for himself, as many specifics for himself as he can, and then he can get to work and produce the next masterpiece. So I'm sure that was very enlightening to the people who first heard it, and hopefully was a help to a lot of people. So anyway, these Harvard lectures by Stravinsky are put together into a book called The Poetics of Music. All right, Schoenberg, the head of the 12-tone technique, the one who developed it, one of his star pupils was named Alban Berg, B-E-R-G. Berg was also a serial composer, but his music is a lot more listenable, shall we say, than the music of Schoenberg. Schoenberg's is severely dissonant. Because remember, with the tone row, and it's atonal, you have dissonance that goes to dissonance that goes to more dissonance and more dissonance. You don't ever resolve anything because that might suggest a tonal center, and it's atonal. So it's dissonant constantly all the time. Berg actually sometimes arranged his tone rows with some thirds in them, so that although it doesn't suggest a tonal center, it at least is a bit more consonant to the listener's ears than other people's 12-tone music. So it's a little bit more mellow sounding in terms of its sonorities, and therefore the average person is able to accept the sound of the music of Berg a little bit more readily than some of the other serial composers. Berg is known for a string quartet, which is entitled the Lyric Suite. It's actually a string quartet, but it has a name. For a violin concerto that's pretty well known, and two operas. One of them, very, very important opera, is Wozzeck. You have an excerpt on your CD. Wozzeck is dated 1917 to 1921. And the other one is an opera called Lulu. And that opera dates from 1928 to 1935. Now, we talked about expressionistic music last time with Pierrot Lunaire. Wozzeck is a great example of an expressionistic opera. It has a pretty sizable orchestra. It has singing in it, and it also has that technique called Sprechstimme as well. The libretto is based upon a play, already existing play. The soldier, Wozzeck, is poor, and he is not at all intelligent. He's very, very slow intellectually. And consequently, people take quite a bit of advantage of him and abuse him and kick him around some. He's, in other words, helpless in the face of fate, a pawn manipulated by more powerful people, powerful forces. He's despised by many, betrayed by people close to him, finally driven to murder, and after that, to suicide. Although it is a totally 12-tone opera, Berg uses quite a few devices from earlier periods. Some examples: suite, rhapsody, song, march, passacaglia, sonata form, fugue, scherzo, rondo, theme and variations, invention. Remember, Bach writes some things called inventions. And as we said, both traditional singing and Sprechstimme. The orchestration is quite brilliantly done. It has amazing sound effects in it, which of course are very reflective of all the tension in the libretto. Lulu, on the other hand, was a barmaid and a prostitute. And so she's taken advantage of by people as well. Lulu was actually unfinished at his death. So there have been sketches that have sort of been fleshed out in order to create an ending for it, but it's still basically incomplete. One of the major opera companies in this country is the Santa Fe Opera. If you ever go there, have a vacation in the mountains and stuff like that, Santa Fe is a very enchanting city, and the opera house is a few miles outside of town, up on a hill. It is an open-air theater, so it gets cold even in the summer in the desert after dark. So you'd want to dress with several layers because it can get to be pretty brutal. But I saw Lulu there once, long ago, and I thought the music was quite glorious. And the singing at Santa Fe is quite glorious also because it's got really talented people there. And it got a pretty cool review in the paper the next day. I could tell that the reviewer was not into modern music really at all. Was accustomed to much more traditional operas, but I thought it was just absolutely glorious, and I'd love to see it again. I don't know that they've ever done it again there, however. All right, Schoenberg's other star pupil was Anton Webern, W-E-B-E-R-N, Webern. Webern, by the way, lived from 1883 to 1945. What's going on in 1945? World War II. Actually, Webern was taken prisoner and was kind of loosely incarcerated, not totally in jail, but not allowed to really go anywhere, just kept with other sort of passive prisoners of war. Anyway, he steps outside for a smoke one night, late at night. American soldier says, "Who goes there?" No answer. Boom! So Webern's dead. Shot, kind of accidentally by an American soldier. But that's what you do in war. No response must be the enemy, pal. Otherwise, the person may kill you. So Too bad. Um, Webern is one of the most seminally influential composers of the 20th century. And it's a shame that he dies prematurely without being able to compose more works. His style is much less liked by the average person, even musician probably, than Berg's, because it is pretty severely dissonant. But Webern is far more influential than Berg in his lasting influence. The music of Webern stimulates a movement among young composers, and this is centered at Darmstadt. And there would be these long summer festivals in Darmstadt where composers from all over would come to study and to share their works with other new up-and-coming composers. And it's a very avant-garde type of thing. And the one common denominator among them all is basically they're disciples of Webern. So all of these people who go to those summer festivals, composition festivals, go out and have influence on other people as well. So Webern has his tentacles really into pretty much the rest of the century. They were experimenters from many countries. And this was in East Germany, when we couldn't get to it for a while. So it was locked off to quite a few people for a while. Two of the principal composers out of the Darmstadt group would be Stockhausen and Pierre Boulez. Pierre Boulez, by the way, was chosen to be one of the successors to Leonard Bernstein, the New York Philharmonic. If Boulez is an avant-garde composer, what do you think he wants to program? The kind of stuff he's really interested in. So it wasn't long before the season subscriptions and the underwriting contributions to the New York Philharmonic fell off seriously. And so they had to find a gracious way to get rid of him, otherwise they might have failed from lack of funding. So they did, but he's an immensely influential compositional character in the 20th century. He was a conductor with a phenomenal ear. He could hear the slightest mistake in any instrument. He's really good at that. But poison to the New York Phil as their music director. All right, characteristics of Webern's style. Big list. Cool, constructive, and less emotional. Extreme economy and concentration. Lots of imitative counterpoint, often in strict canon. No repetition or sequence. Melody constructed of large intervals. Texture, very spare. All right. In other words, very few instruments, and not all of them are playing at any given moment, since there are lots of rests in each part. So instruments don't play constantly. They just have little wisps of sound that they contribute to the texture, and that's all. They are resting quite a bit. Rhythm, very complex, with several rhythmic layers going on at the same time. Dynamics, specified very carefully and specifically. Seldom loud. Unusual combinations of instruments. The melodic line distributed among several different instruments. And thus different tone qualities as well. Not unlike the medieval Hocket. Special orchestral effects including pizzicato, harmonics, tremolos, mutes. Twelve-tone with complicated usages of the tone row. Pointillism. Pointillism. All right, this has to do with melody, mostly, with the notes so far apart. Just jumping around, these little bitty wisps of sound. Pointillism. Another term that we borrowed out of art. Now, part of Webern's influence is that he takes the principles of serialism and starts to apply them to things other than pitch. What are some other musical elements that you could serialize? Dynamics, rhythm, articulation, okay? All of the possibilities within each of those musical elements. You could put in a certain order. You can use the order frontwards and backwards. I don't know how you invert articulation. But maybe somebody could dream up how to do it. All right, well, when you're doing this with multiple elements, not just pitch, we actually give it a term. It's called total serialism. Total serialism. I guess you could actually serialize timbre, tone quality. You could probably serialize texture. How many instruments are playing at the same time? You know, thick texture, thin texture. Total serialism, that means that the composer has pretty much total control over the music. It doesn't leave much of any kind of room for interpretation. You've got so many specified things to follow. one's very, very difficult to react to that fast, but there's nothing else for you to actually contribute to it because the composer has more or less total control over it. Now, to the listener, of course, it sounds like randomness. It sounds like chaos. But in fact, it's the exact opposite of that. It's basically total control by the composer. It's not unpredictable. It is totally predictive. All right, well, one of the major composers who used this style of total serialism Messiaen. Kinsella really loves Messiaen. He's also one of the people who can play stuff like that. Messiaen's important partly because he was a teacher of Boulez and Stockhausen, these major people who came out of Darmstadt. In fact, Messiaen was the teacher of a host of important composers. But interestingly enough, out of so many students that he had, none of them really carried on his style. They carried on their own styles. So, as an originating factor, his training sort of became like a hydra and went off into many different directions through his pupils. So he's not the center of any kind of a school, but he is influential with others. Messiaen loved nature. He actually went out and listened to birds, and he wrote down in pitch various bird songs, bird calls, and he institutes these in his pieces. And sometimes he actually writes on the score, this is such and such a bird, and sure enough it is. Good example of the style of Messiaen is a piece called Quartet for the End of Time. Quartet for the End of Time. The instrumentation is violin, clarinet, cello, and piano. In this, he uses the medieval principle of isorhythm, something we studied a long time ago. It creates both melodic and rhythmic ostinatos. He uses music of India. We find this to be a fairly difficult piece to perform. It's doable, but it does take pretty expert people. It is much harder to read off the page than it sounds, especially rhythmically. The interesting thing is that he wrote this for himself and 3 other prisoners, because he was a prisoner of war at the time. He and 3 other prisoners. So he must have found some people who were really good in order to be able to play this piece together. Pretty astonishing. 1941 German military prison camp. Other things sometimes used by Messiaen: modes, chants, eight-note scales, chords built out of the upper partials of a fundamental tone. We probably should look at that because, for one thing, there's a question on the Texas certification exam. And you have to actually know this. So we usually like to see things based on C, is that right? Yeah. All right, let's go. So we need the grand staff. All right, let's say
this is the note in question. The note that you play, we'll just take this since it gives us a lot of room on the staff. The note that you play is called the fundamental tone. When a note is played, this is not the only one you actually hear. There's a whole package of notes up higher than that, which are sounding. Now, if the piano were really in great tune and the room was very, very quiet, we could probably play this note a few times and show you that you can actually hear 2, 3, 4 other notes sounding. You can just know what to listen for, and you give it a few seconds for that note to emerge from the sound. So, everything else you're hearing are called partial. So the first partial is an octave higher. The second partial is the fifth. The third partial is another octave. The fourth partial is the third. The next one is the fifth again. The next one is a minor seventh off it. And then you have some steps, and eventually they become microtones. Now those are all out of human hearing, of course. But I dare say that if we had a quiet room with an in-tune piano, that we could get everybody to hear this note. Just about everybody. That we'd be able to play this note, and we get to where we could hear this one, and this one, and this one, and this one. And after that, it'd be pretty hard to get to take weeks probably. But I don't think I can do it, because I don't do this stuff. Now, the question you would get on the text test is, what is the interval between the something and something else partial? So let's say they're asking you the interval between the third and fourth partial. You've got to know that this is the first, the second, the third, the fourth. So your answer would be a major third. And if you want to practice this, the note we have gotten in the past has been an F. So if you want to practice that, be prepared for it. Chances are that's the one that you'll eventually get. Now, of course, this is the same thing as the harmonic series, the overtone series. That's right. Exactly what it is.
On piano, if you play like a C and then the octave and fifth above, you press that slowly, and it'll just
And it doesn't strike the
strike, and you press the C at the octave and shift below, that G will sound.
Yes, they will emerge after a little bit. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so Messiaen likes to build chords out of some of the upper partials of things. It's kind of a cool concept, but of course, the higher you get in the package, the more dissonant it's going to become. After World War II, composers used a lot of new and unusual sounds, things like flutter tonguing, glissandos, harmonics. Term you should know, colegno, which means with the wood. That's right, turning the bow upside down on the strings, doing it with the wood, not the hair. Tone clusters, whispering, speaking, unusual percussion sounds like chains, whips, saws, anvils, sirens, all sorts of unusual sounds put into compositions. One of the major movements of the 20th century
is sounds which are electronically produced or manipulated. There is a style of this which is called musique concrète. Musique concrète. Obviously French term, but we said France is one of the really avant-garde places after the century gets going. All right, so what's this? You start with natural sounds. Those could be produced by an instrument or produced by the voice. These were recorded and then electronically manipulated and then recorded again. And so the recording is the composition. So at that point, there is no longer a performer. The recording is the composition. So you start with natural sounds, subject them to electronic manipulation, record them, the recording is the piece. So this opens up a lot of new possibilities for composers, lots of new sounds, and also taking the performer out of the picture. So now the composer can really control everything. Although works like this can be produced and then combined with live performers as well, so that you have both a live performer and a recording performing simultaneously. There's plenty of music like that. The process of producing electronically manipulated recordings like that was pretty cumbersome for a while, and that was really what led to the synthesizer. Now, a true synthesizer is not a keyboard. A true synthesizer is something that actually can manipulate those sounds. The keyboards that just have the record of what's already been done. But a true synthesizer, as they were originally produced, would be something kind of this size or larger, and it would have things that you would plug in, it would have dials, it would have switches, it would have all kinds of things, so that you can actually sit and produce types of sounds. Now, all the types of sounds have their own shapes of sound waves. So something like this on an oscilloscope, this is called a sine wave, S-I-N-E, and that would be a certain sound type. You could have sound wave that looks like that. That would be a sawtooth wave. That would be a different sound. All sorts of things that can be done with this synthesizer. So that would mean then that the composer sits at the synthesizer and rather extemporaneously uses it to produce these sounds as the performance in front of an audience. Well, what is that? Yes?
Is that like the Moog or?
Right. M-O-O-G, a Moog synthesizer. And there weren't really that many of them because they were expensive. Universities don't like to sink that much money into musical things. And, you know, how many people are going to do it, and how many people are going to come to listen to it, you know. So it would be a major active investment for universities to jump in for things like that. And so it would have to really be a center, C-E-N-T-R-E, center of modern music. And we never had very many of those. I have actually seen somebody do that live. And the audience is always very enchanted, but you know, there's a limit before they sort of get desensitized to it and get tired of it. But it was certainly interesting for composition students to be able to sit at that great big synthesizer and create these sound types and manipulate them and change them and produce anything they could figure out to do. Now, in a composition course like that, you also kind of have to be a mathematician because there's a certain amount of really high-level math that goes along with that. And that's not everybody's cup of tea. Certainly not mine. But it's another way kind of taking performers out of the picture. To eliminate the expense, this is where we get computer chips now that we can put into a keyboard so that you no longer have unlimited control over it. You can reproduce what's on that chip, and that's what's at your disposal. But this way you know exactly what a true synthesizer is. Okay, that's pretty much our time. Let me give you your next study guide so that you have plenty of time. I'm afraid I got nothing done since I told you before on the last one. And now I've just accepted a weekend project, so it's getting tough.
We're just gonna have to like. Oh, we just heard this one. What is it? I already forgot.